Yamasee War 7, 15–17, the near destruction of South Carolina. Full documentary. The year is 1715, and the cries of terrified colonists echo through the burning Carolina countryside. The Yamasee War has begun. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories for more captivating tales from the past. Acrid smoke stung the eyes and filled the nostrils of those fleeing towards Charlestown. Behind them, once familiar fields and homesteads were engulfed in flames, the air thick with the stench of burning wood, and the chilling screams of those who could not escape. The sudden inferno. Indian war parties, their painted faces grim in the firelight, moved like phantoms through the smoke, wielding tomahawks and torches with deadly efficiency. The Indians that surround us on every side revolted from us by unanimous consent, wrote Minister Francis Liggio, his quill scratching frantically across the page. A desperate attempt to document the unfolding chaos. Inside Charlestown, the situation grew more precarious by the hour. Refugees huddled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Food was scarce, clean water even more so. Disease spread rapidly through the cramped and unsanitary conditions. Governor Charles Craven, his brow furrowed with worry, surveyed the desperate scene. The colony he had sworn to protect was on the brink of collapse. "We are almost naked and defenseless," he confessed to his council, "and know not how soon some of us may be in the hands of those monsters of mankind, the Indians." Reverend Thomas Hassel, his voice trembling, sought answers in Scripture. "When ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send a pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy." He read aloud from Leviticus, his words fueling the fear that gripped the hearts of the colonists. Yet this war, as with many conflicts throughout history, had not been inevitable for decades. A tenuous peace had reigned between the colony and the native tribes. Trade had been the lifeblood of their coexistence, with deerskins flowing from the forests into the hands of eager colonists, exchanged for European tools, weapons, and trinkets. The native tribes, in turn, served as a protective barrier against common enemies, the Spanish lurking to the south, the French encroaching from the west, and the tribes further inland, who were often the target of brutal slave raids. South Carolina, founded in 1670 with dreams of plantation riches, initially faced a harsh reality. It took decades for the colony to establish rice and indigo as profitable crops. In the meantime, they relied on exports of cattle, hogs, and the ubiquitous deerskins. Tragically, they also relied on the trade of Indian slaves. Deerskins, also known as buckskins, were so central to the early Carolina economy that they were used as currency. $5 for that fine knife a trapper might barter, or $10 for a warm winter coat. A colonist might offer the term buck. Eventually became shorthand for the dollar we use today. Ironically, the lord proprietors, the 8 aristocrats who governed the colony, had expressly forbidden the Indian slave trade, recognizing the inherent danger it posed. However, the vast distance separating the colony from its rulers, and the relentless pursuit of profit, led to lax enforcement. Wealthy colonists, known as the Goose Creek Men, saw an opportunity to exploit this. They actively encouraged tribes like the Yamasee to participate in slave raids, offering guns, powder, and other valuable European goods in exchange for captured natives. The Yamasee, unlike many of the more established tribes in the region, were relative newcomers. A composite people thrown together by circumstance is how writer Scott Wood Denzel described them. A blend of various displaced groups who had coalesced into a distinct tribal identity. First documented by the Spanish in St. Augustine. In 1663, their numbers gradually increased as they migrated north and settled in the Port Royal area of South Carolina. By the early 1700s, 10 Yamasee towns thrived in the region, with a total population of around 1,300. During this period, South Carolina established a network of trading, sending traders to live amongst the Yamasee Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Catawba, and other tribes for a time. These trade relationships fostered a sense of peaceful coexistence. The Yamasee even allied with South Carolina in earlier conflicts, their warriors fighting alongside the colonists. Thomas Nairn, the colony's Indian agent, famously declared in 1710 that all of the Indians within 700 miles of Charlestown had been made English subjects. However, this seemingly harmonious relationship masked a growing tension. The insidious problem of escalating debt. Unscrupulous colonial traders readily extended credit to the Yamasee and other tribes, allowing them to purchase goods in anticipation of future payment, typically in the form of deerskins. This system worked well as long as deerskins remained plentiful. However, a decade of overhunting had taken its toll, and the deer population dwindled, making it increasingly difficult for the Yamasee to meet their obligations. By 1711, the Yamasee faced a staggering collective debt of over 100,000 deerskins, a sum greater than the colony's typical annual export. Desperate to recoup their losses, the colonial authorities pushed the already active Indian slave trade into overdrive. It is reported that some of our inhabitants excite them, Indians, to make war amongst themselves to get slaves, which they give for our European goods, wrote Minister Francis Lejow in his journal, a stark indictment of the colony's exploitative practices. An enslaved Indian was worth far more than a deerskin, and many Yamasee, facing the crushing weight of debt, saw this as a way out. Between 1617 and 1715, it is estimated that 24,000 to 51,000 Native Americans were sold into slavery from South Carolina, a number exceeding even the number of African slaves brought into the colony during the same period. As debts remained unpaid, Carolina traders grew increasingly aggressive. Some resorted to threats, vowing to enslave the families of those who could not pay, further inflaming tensions with the Yamasee and other tribes. The colonists, despite their advanced weaponry, were vastly outnumbered by the native population. A census conducted in early 1715 revealed the extent of this disparity. The colony counted 141 Native American towns with a combined population of 28,000. In contrast, South Carolina had approximately 7,000 colonists, supplemented by 4,000 enslaved Africans. The census, while intended to gather information, was perceived by many Native Americans as a sinister precursor to further enslavement. Amidst this growing unrest, Governor Charles Craven dispatched a small delegation to meet with the Yamasee at Pocataligo, one of their main towns near Port Royal. The delegation, comprising at least 6 individuals, was tasked with a dual mission: to appease the Yamasee and secure their support against the Lower Creek, who were rumored to be planning an attack on the colony. However, this diplomatic effort was fatally undermined by internal conflict and miscommunication. The delegation included 2 men vying for the same position: Thomas Nairn, the incumbent Indian agent, and his rival John Wright. Instead of presenting a united front, they held separate meetings with the Yamasee, leading to disastrous consequences. Nairn, in his meeting, adopted a conciliatory approach. He assured the Yamasee of the colony's friendship, promising that Governor Craven would personally address their concerns about debt, and that there was no intention of displacing them from their lands. He even condemned the aggressive tactics of the traders, assuring the Yamasee that they had no right to enslave them. Nairn's words were well received, leaving the Yamasee optimistic about a peaceful resolution. However, their hopes were shattered when John Wright, eager to undermine his rival, held his own meeting. Instead of building on Nairn's success, Wright adopted a confrontational stance, threatening the Yamasee and insulting their pride. This schizophrenic policy, as historian William L. Ramsey termed it, left the Yamasee bewildered and suspicious. They debated late into the night, uncertain of the colony's true intentions. By daybreak, they had reached a decision. The war paint came out at dawn. Their terrible war whoop was heard, and a great multitude was seen, whose faces and several other parts of their bodies were painted with red and black streaks, resembling devils come out of hell, wrote a horrified colonist. It is usually in this guise that they appear in war. The red indicates war, and the black represents the death without mercy, which their enemies must expect. The Yamasee attacked swiftly and decisively. They threw themselves first upon the agents, and on Mr. Wright, seized their houses and effects, fired on everybody without distinction, and put to death with torture in the most cruel manner in the world. The account continued. This vivid account of the Yamasee attack comes from a letter written by Charles Rodd, a colonial merchant, to his employer in London. Rodd's letter, one of the most comprehensive primary sources on the Yamasee War, provides a detailed chronicle of the initial attack on Pocataligo and the harrowing events that followed. According to Rod, one man, Captain Burrows, narrowly escaped the massacre at Pocataligo. He managed to swim across a river, though not without sustaining 2 severe gunshot wounds, one of which pierced his neck and came out his mouth, and the other pierced his back and lodged in his chest, without touching a vital spot. Rod described despite these grievous injuries, Burrows, now essentially a human snorkel, made his way to the nearby settlement of Port Royal to warn of the impending attack. Burrows's arrival in Port Royal sparked panic and a frantic evacuation. While some initially doubted his story, the gaping wounds on his neck and back, coupled with the distant sounds of gunfire and screams, were convincing enough for most. With overland escape routes blocked by hostile forces, the colonists turned to the sea. Hundreds of settlers scrambled aboard a smuggler ship anchored in the harbor, hoping to find safety at sea. Rod writes they received the wretched inhabitants, to the number of about 400. And as night drew on, scarcely had these unfortunates got on board when the Indians entered the plantations and, finding nobody in the houses, came down to the water's edge and fired heavily on the ship all the night but killed no one. They continually repeated their diabolical war whoop as they fired. The Yamasee, frustrated by their inability to reach the colonists on the ship, turned their fury on the surrounding area. Next day, they killed the horses and cattle with gunshots and sacked and plundered everything they met, with dancing in a grotesque fashion and uttering loud cries of joy, which they fired and burnt the houses, Rod recounted. Such a spectacle might have given pleasure had not the results been so disastrous, he added. The following day, with the rising tide, the overcrowded smuggler ship managed to escape Port Royal and sail north towards Charlestown. Other colonists fled in canoes, navigating the treacherous sea islands or braving the open ocean in a desperate bid for survival. Despite these efforts, over 100 colonists from the plantations surrounding Pocataligo and Port Royal were killed or captured during the initial Yamasee attacks. One colonist, whose name is lost to history, managed to evade capture through a rather unorthodox method. He hid in a marsh completely naked, believing that his nudity would make him blend in with the native warriors. While his logic might seem flawed, his desperate gamble paid off. He survived to witness the gruesome fate that befell many of his fellow colonists, including the unfortunate Indian agent Thomas Nairn. The criminals loaded Mr. Nairn with a great number of pieces of wood, to which they set fire and burnt him in this manner, so that he suffered a horrible torture during several days before he was allowed to die. Rod reported his words, conveying the brutality of the Yamasee. The letter suggests that this form of ritualistic torture was inflicted upon many of those captured by the Yamasee. News of these atrocities spread like wildfire, fueling terror among the colonists and prompting a mass exodus towards the perceived safety of Charlestown. Unbeknownst to the Yamasee, Governor Craven had already set out from Charlestown with a militia force of around 150 men on Good Friday. Intending to travel to Pocataligo, the Yamasee learned of this expedition from himself during his captivity. Yamasee scouts located Craven's militia detachment early on, but it wasn't until April 19th that a full-fledged battle erupted. Despite being outnumbered, the colonial militia held a tactical advantage in the open terrain. The colonists suffered 20 casualties, but the Yamasee were eventually forced to retreat after several of their leaders were killed. One of the fallen Yamasee warriors carried a letter intended for Governor Craven, written by a white captive, but dictated by a prominent Yamasee leader known as the Hospa King. The letter offered a chilling explanation for the Yamasee attacks and revealed their ultimate objective. Mr. Wright said that the white men would come and fetch the Yamasees in one night, and that they would hang 4 of the head men and take all the rest of them for slaves, and that he would send them all off the country. He said that the men of the Yamasees were like women. The letter stated what he said vexed the great warriors, and this made them begin the war. And the Indians have killed 40 or 50 white persons, and the Indians are all coming to take all the country. There are 300 that they're gonna watch to take the fort at Captain Woodward's, and that at Welltown. For in short, all of the Indians upon the main are coming, and they say that the white people will not be a handful for them. The Yamasee's intention was clear: the complete annihilation of the colony. While revealing their troop numbers and planned targets might seem strategically unsound, it undeniably heightened the sense of dread among the colonists. With 300 warriors, the Yamasee alone posed a significant threat. But the true danger lay in the potential for a widespread native uprising. The intercepted letter ominously declared that all the Indians upon the main are coming. While not quite on the scale of the Battle of Little Bighorn, the prospect of facing a united indigenous force was undoubtedly terrifying for the outnumbered colonists. The initial meeting with the Yamasee at Pocataligo, which ultimately triggered the war, had been prompted by rumors of an impending attack by other tribes, particularly the Lower Creek. The Yamasee's grievances, crippling debt, loss of hunting grounds, fear of enslavement, and the abusive behavior of traders resonated with many other tribes in the region. The Yamasee's decisive action served as a catalyst, emboldening other tribes to take up arms against the colonists. In the weeks that followed, the South Carolina backcountry descended into chaos. The approximately 100 traders who had been living among the various tribes became prime targets. 90 of them were killed, and the few who survived did so by a hair's breadth. The Lower Creek Cherokee, Catawba, and Chickasaw were among the tribes that participated in the widespread attacks on traders. A study by the University of South Carolina suggests that the targeted killing of traders was a deliberate message from the Native Americans, signaling that mere promises of reform from the English were no longer sufficient. The killing of the traders represented a decisive severing of ties, a declaration that existing alliances were null and void. It was a forceful call for the English to acknowledge the need for a complete reset in their relationship with the native tribes. By early May, news of these killings reached Charlestown, further escalating the panic. Colonists from the South and the back country had already flooded into the city, seeking refuge from the escalating violence. Within Charlestown's walls, the refugees braced themselves for the inevitable attacks as tribes like the Catawba formally declared war on the colony. On May 14th, the raids began in earnest, targeting plantations around Charlestown. These attacks would persist relentlessly for the next 2 months. The initial assaults focused on the Goose Creek area, north of Charlestown. On May 16th, a Catawba war party comprising hundreds of warriors ambushed a colonial militia force of roughly 100 men. The militia suffered heavy losses, with a quarter of their men killed and the rest forced into a disorganized retreat. Back towards Charlestown, the Goose Creek area was swiftly evacuated, its colonists fleeing for their lives. Minister Francis LeJoux, witnessing the relentless attacks, believed that all hope was lost for South Carolina. "If this torrent of Indians continue to fall upon us, there is no resisting," he wrote despairingly in his journal. LeJoux believed that the colony might be completely abandoned, left to the mercy of the enemy. For weeks, the northern regions of the colony remained utterly defenseless. Even fortified plantations were not immune to attack. On July 5th, Shanking's fort, where 30 men had sought refuge, was overrun. Larry E. Ivers, in his book This Torrent of Indians, recounts the events of that day. According to Ives, the fort's commander, Redwood, was approached by the Indians with a proposal for peace talks. Redwood relented and invited a delegation of unarmed Indians inside the stockade walls for a conference. Ives writes, as a show of trustworthiness, he ordered his men to lay down their weapons. The war captains accepted the invitation, and their representatives entered the fort. However, the peace talks were a ruse. At some point during the subsequent negotiations, the warriors suddenly drew knives and hatchets that they had concealed about their persons and attacked the disarmed South Carolinians. Ivers describes the attack was swift and brutal. Approximately 20 colonists were killed and another 10 were taken prisoner. The violence continued unabated throughout the countryside, with plantations razed and livestock slaughtered. The Indians, encountering little resistance, grew increasingly confident. They even sent for their families, presumably to assist in carrying off the looted goods. In a display of overconfidence, they ceased utilizing scouts and patrols, leaving themselves vulnerable to counterattack. On June 13th, this carelessness proved to be their undoing. Captain Chicken, leading a militia force of about 120 men, caught a large war party completely off guard. The militia routed the war party, killing approximately 40 warriors. This victory provided the first significant respite for the beleaguered colony. The Catawba, having suffered substantial losses, withdrew from the war, however. The damage had already been done. The Goose Creek settlements were devastated, their supplies depleted, their homes destroyed. With other tribes mobilizing to the west, the surviving colonists had no choice but to seek refuge in Charlestown. By June and July of 1715, virtually the entire colonial population was concentrated in fortified settlements or crammed within the confines of Charlestown. Throughout May, desperate preparations had been underway. Martial law was declared, and the colonial government commandeered all available weapons, provisions, medicines, and ships. However, these measures were merely a stopgap. Without external aid, the colony lacked the manpower and resources to withstand a sustained assault. Food shortages posed another critical challenge. While crops and livestock remained available outside the city, every Indian raid resulted in the destruction of vital resources. Colonists were trapped, unable to venture beyond the city walls. Without risking their lives, desperate pleas for assistance were dispatched to the northern colonies and the Lord Proprietors. But there was no guarantee of timely support, if any at all. Virginia offered to send troops, but only on the condition that South Carolina provide enslaved women in exchange. This audacious proposition, though shocking, was a reflection of the complex social and political dynamics of the time. The Virginia governor later remarked that South Carolina's failure to send any enslaved women indicated a lack of seriousness in their request. North Carolina, however, responded with genuine support. By early July, they dispatched 110 men southward, including 60 Native American allies, to assist in the defense of South Carolina. Governor Craven led a militia force north to rendezvous with these reinforcements, but his absence created an opportunity for the enemy. War parties composed of warriors from various tribes, and estimated to be between 500 and 700 strong, crossed the Edisto River at the Pompon Bridge. They attacked Willtown, just as the Hospa King's letter had warned, but they bypassed the fortified settlement itself. The defenders within the fort fired upon the attackers, but the war parties focused their efforts on the surrounding plantations, plundering and burning with impunity. This latest raid brought the war parties to within 12 miles of Charlestown, with the majority of the colony's population concentrated in the city and provisions running low. The situation was dire. The only significant fighting force outside of fortified settlements was Craven's militia, now far to the north. The remaining defenders in Charlestown were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and on the verge of starvation. One final push from the Native American alliance could have spelled the end of South Carolina. As the people of Charlestown waited in fear, the words of the Hospa King echoed in their minds. The Indians are all coming to take all of the country. Yet despite having the colony within their grasp, the war parties inexplicably halted their advance. The Native Americans held every advantage. They outnumbered the colonial forces by 5 to 1. They could have easily overrun Charlestown, capturing or killing its inhabitants and seizing control of the colony. The potential consequences of such a victory extended far beyond South Carolina. Political leaders in other colonies, such as Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, feared the domino effect that the fall of South Carolina might have, inspiring other tribes to unite against colonial rule. However, this decisive blow never came. Governor Craven, receiving urgent news of the raids near Charlestown, immediately abandoned his northward journey to confront the enemy. Ironically, his forces had just spent an entire day crossing a river, only to turn around and spend the rest of the day crossing back. The large war party, for reasons unknown, retreated westward before Craven could engage them. They withdrew satisfied with the plunder, scalps, and widespread destruction they had wrought. As a final act of defiance, they burned the Pompon Bridge behind them, preventing Craven's forces from pursuing them. This marked the end of the major offensive operations in the Yamasee War. The Native American alliance, despite its initial success, ultimately faltered. One common misconception is to view Native Americans as a monolithic entity, but the reality was far more complex. The various tribes were divided by distinct cultures, long-held rivalries, and competing goals. Tribal populations in the 18th century were relatively small, making the loss of even 20 or 30 warriors in battle a significant blow to a tribe's security and survival. Consequently, tribes rarely engaged in battles unless they were confident of victory. This was precisely what had happened to the Catawba. Their significant losses in the Goose Creek raids had forced them to reconsider their involvement in the conflict. Open warfare with its inherent risks was not a sustainable strategy for the Native American tribes. Raids, on the other hand, offered a means of inflicting damage while minimizing casualties. The Yamasee War would drag on for another 3 years, but after the Western raids in July of 1715, the colony of South Carolina was again in imminent danger of collapse. Many tribes that had initially joined the war effort soon found their commitment wavering. Several factors contributed to this shift in allegiance. Old rivalries resurfaced, and the lure of trade with the Europeans proved difficult to resist. The Cherokee, for example, who had allied with the Catawba in the northern raids, were also rivals of the Creek. While temporary cooperation against the colonists might have been beneficial, the long-standing animosity between these tribes, coupled with the desire to maintain access to European trade goods, ultimately outweighed their shared grievances against the colonists. Furthermore, the Native American war effort was hampered by supply shortages. Guns and gunpowder, essential for waging war against the well-armed colonists, became increasingly scarce. Some tribes, recognizing their dependence on these European goods, chose to switch sides, aligning themselves with the colony. In exchange for continued access to vital supplies, the colony, now facing the very real threat of annihilation, adopted a more conciliatory stance towards the Native Americans, recognizing the urgent need for allies. This shift in attitude, coupled with the expulsion of the Yamasee, created opportunities for other tribes to forge new alliances and secure advantageous trading partnerships. The Catawba, for example, who had inflicted significant casualties on the colonists north of Charleston, saw the Yamasee's expulsion as a chance to become the colony's primary trading partner. They seized this opportunity, solidifying their position within the colonial system. Meanwhile, shipments of much-needed firearms arrived from Virginia and Boston, bolstering the colonists' confines and their ability to defend themselves. While small-scale raids, primarily from the lower creek, persisted until 1717, the tide had turned. The colony had weathered the storm, and its survival was no longer in doubt. The Yamasee, who had ignited the conflict, ultimately paid a heavy price for their defiance. By August of 1715, a quarter of their population had been enslaved, and the survivors were forced to flee South Carolina. Some sought refuge with the lower creek, while others joined the Spanish in St. Augustine. The Yamasee War, though named after them, was not solely